Hey everybody, Melon here. Welcome back to another episode of Teardown. Today we're going to be tearing down the PWNAGE Trinity. Now, the Trinity is a very interesting release from PWNAGE, as this mouse marks a lot of new firsts for them, as this is not only their first symmetrical release in a very long time, as in the past they've only really focused on ergos and the Stormbreaker. This is their first carbon fiber mouse, which is a new material for them as opposed to the magnesium materials we've seen them use before. But while this mouse marks a lot of firsts for PWNAGE and kind of a new age for them, so to speak, this mouse does unfortunately repeat many of the same design mistakes as we've seen on their previous mice, and it also has some new QC related issues that we're going to talk more about how to fix in this video. But regardless, despite its mixed bag in terms of its nature, I still wanted to make a full teardown guide to show you guys how everything worked on the inside of the Trinity here, especially because this is using a new carbon fiber material. But before we get into it, as always, whenever you do a teardown, you will need a couple things. Firstly, having a precision set of screwdrivers is going to be very helpful. Now, all the screws inside the Trinity are Phillips heads, but they do vary in size quite significantly, so having some smaller bits will make this teardown much easier. Also, having something to keep track of your screws like an ice cube tray or magnetic mat is highly advisable, so you don't mix the screws up on the inside of the unit. And having something like a microfiber cloth or just something to put your mouse on as you do your teardown to hold it in place will also be very helpful. But once you assembled all that, you are ready to go ahead and get started, so let's go ahead and tear down the PWNAGE Trinity. Alright, now the first thing we have to do here is remove the top shell from the base shell. Now this is actually quite easy to do, as just like PWNAGE's previous mice, there are only 2 access screws on the bottom of this mouse holding the shells together, but you will need to remove your stock skates to access these screw holes, but you can just replace them with the extra set of skates that are included with the Trinity or the aftermarket dot skates. But once you remove your screws, we can go ahead and remove a screw from here and a screw from here. And then with that removed, go ahead and make a pincer with your hands and put pressure on both sides of this rear hump here. And with a little bit of pressure to the sides, you'll see the base will kind of open up like this. And then you can just take a fingernail or a pry tool and run along the sides of the mouse to release the base clamps. There is a clip here and there's another clip here. Now, full disclosure, I did break one of these clamps when I was taking this mouse apart for the full review, but that doesn't significantly affect any other aspect of this mouse. Now, once you have the shells kind of apart like this, the base shell is anchored to the top shell via some clips that are located up here, and getting them off is kind of tricky as the scroll wheel kind of prevents you from pulling this off. So what you have to do is hold the mouse on its side, and while pressing downward, you also have to pull the top shell up in a way where there will be a lot of pressure, but after enough pressure, you should be able to pop it off just like that. Now be careful not to rip the shells apart, as there is a ribbon cable for the side buttons here, and you can disconnect this cable by pulling up the 2 sides of this connector here, just like this, and gently pulling this ribbon cable out. Again, just be careful with this cable because it is very fragile. Alright, and now that you have the top and the base shell disconnected, before I move on with this teardown guide, I want to quickly make a little subsection here talking about the 2 common issues you'll find on the Trinity and how to fix them. Now, the first issue you may run into on your Trinity is that the main clicks will have uneven actuation weights, like my unit, and that is because of some tensioning issues here on the main click screws. Now, to fix this, all you have to do is retension both of these screws, and you want to make sure you turn them until you feel a little bit of feedback from the screw. Don't over tighten them because that will break the main clicks. There's a little bit of a sweet spot you have to find. Now, what happened on my unit is that one of these screws was tensioned perfectly and the other one wasn't even tensioned at all, which is why I had issues with my main click out of the box. But with a couple turns, I was able to retension this properly, and now my main clicks are performing as expected. The second issue you might have with your Trinity is the side buttons. Now, as I talked about in my full review, this is because the actual bracing mechanism for the side button is quite flawed. As you can see here on one side, it is anchored in properly, but on this side, it's just in this U-shaped connector. And what happened with my unit is that out of the box, the factory didn't properly tension this little anchoring screw here. This PCB would actually shift around inside the unit, which is what caused the issues with the side buttons out of the box. Now, this is easy to fix, as all you have to do is retension the central anchoring screw here, but because there's no holder here, you have to be a little careful, and you kind of have to find a sweet spot for this screw like you did with these 2 here, as if you under tension this, the PCB will still shift around and move around, and if you over tension it, what will happen is you can actually force the PCB out of its position like this, and it will actually cause the side buttons not to actually work, specifically the front one. So what you have to do is kind of find this sweet spot, as I mentioned earlier, but you have to do it in a way where you're holding the PCB into its proper place and making sure it doesn't slot out of this U-shaped holder. Now, if you want to do this the safer way, you can take some hot glue and actually glue it into position. That's what I would recommend doing, as that will hold it in place. But if you just want to do it by hand and just make sure it's a quick fix, just hold the PCB into its place and make sure you're pushing the PCB against its front anchor here, and then just gently tighten this screw screw until you feel a little bit of feedback from the screw. Once you've kind of found that sweet range, make sure that the PCB doesn't shift at all, and then go ahead and check your side buttons to make sure they are still functioning, and if you're functioning, they are good to go. Alright, and that is how you fix the two major issues you'll find here on the Trinity. Now, if you just want to go ahead and put your unit back together, now you fix these two problems, you can go ahead and skip towards the end of the video where I do the reassembly process. There will be a timestamp for that, and if you just want to see how the rest of the unit is built on the inside, you can go ahead and keep watching. Alright, now with that, let's go ahead and disassemble the Trinity's top shell. First off, we're going to go ahead and remove the side button PCB here, which is quite easy to do as all we have to do is remove this central anchoring screw. And with that removed, you can just gently grab the PCB and it will just literally fall out of the shell just like that. So very easy to remove. We'll put that off to the side. And then next we can also remove these side buttons themselves, which are just stuck into these kind of U-shaped connectors here. And all you have to do to remove these is just pull up on the sides here, pull up on the other side, and the side buttons will pop out of the shell just like that. Very, very easy to remove. Next we have the main clicks. Now, due to the new unique anchoring mechanism PWNAGE is using for these main clicks, they are a little difficult to remove because they're anchored here, not here, like they usually are on most mice, so the actual process of removing them is kinda tricky. But if you do need to remove them, what you do first is remove these two anchoring screws. And then with those screws removed, pull up from the side here to pull them off of their anchoring screws, and then push down towards here and push forward, and with enough pressure you can pop the clicks out of the shell. Again, this is a very unique way of anchoring main clicks, and thankfully due to the carbon fiber material there's a lot of flex on this area, so you can pull it out fairly easily, but again, a bit of a unique way of anchoring your main clicks. Alright, and then with everything removed, that is the top shell of the Trinity all taken apart. Let's put that off to the side for now, and let's focus on the base next. Alright, now for the Trinity's base, this is going to look quite familiar if you watch my teardowns of the Stormbreakers, as the Trinity is using the exact same PCB and design layout as those mice. This is going to be a fairly simple process, but I'll walk you guys through the whole thing regardless. Now first off, we're going to go ahead and disconnect the battery, and we can do so by just grabbing both sides of this JST connector here and just wiggling up from the top. And you can pop that off just like that. Next, we're also going to disconnect the adjustable sensor here, and we're going to disconnect it from the sensor side. And just like the side button ribbon cable, we'll pull up from the sides of this connector and wiggle up and pull out. Again, just be very gentle with this cable. And then once everything is removed from there, we can remove the 4 anchoring screws for the main board, which are here, 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 and here. And then with all those screws removed, all we have to do is just grab the PCB and just pull it straight up. Like that. Again, just pull straight up because there is a standoff here for the scroll wheel, so make sure you just pull straight up, and the board comes off in one solid piece. We'll put the base off to the side for now, and then on the main board here, the one thing we can remove is the scroll wheel, which we can do by just grabbing the scroll wheel and gently pulling to the right, and the scroll wheel will pop out of the main board. And then this ribbon cable here, I wouldn't recommend removing it, but if you have to, you just do the exact same process as you do for the other side of this connector, and to reseat it is the exact same process, but I'm going to leave it intact for this video. And then lastly, on the base here, we have the sensor PCB, which is anchored in by the 2 screws that are here and here, so we'll go ahead and remove those next. And with those removed, you can just grab this PCB and pull it straight off of the base, just like that. And then lastly on the base shell here, we do also have a 300 mAh battery, which we can remove if you want to. It is just stuck down via an adhesive pad here, but due to the base's thinness, I'm not going to remove it in this teardown video because I'm a little concerned about warping the base. If you do have to remove this, I'd recommend dissolving this adhesive pad with some alcohol just to make sure you can take it off easily, but you will need to replace the pad when you do replace the battery. But that's everything for the base shell here, so I'll put that off to the side for now. And now let's talk about the PCB layout here for the Trinity. Now starting off with the side buttons here, we have the same Omron black shell blue dot micro switches we saw used on the previous PWNAGE mice. These switches are fine. These ones are much lighter than the ones we saw on the Stormbreaker, even though they are the same type, which is a nice thing to see, so they don't have that heavy clunkiness we saw on those previous buttons. For the sensor here, we have the PWNAGE X0 or Zero sensor. I'm not exactly sure how they pronounce it, but this is just a renamed PA 3950 as we've seen with all the other custom named sensors available on the market. And on the main board itself, up at the front here, we have the Omron main click switches, which again are binned and rated for 70 million actuations. We have our TTC 11mm scroll wheel encoder here. We have our Kale or TTC pillar switch for the scroll wheel switch. Again, I wasn't able to identify it because it's just, there's no identifying markers on it, but it is probably made by one of those 2 brands. And we have our Nordic 52840 MCU here. Again, the exact same PCB layout that we saw on the Stormbreaker. Alright, now that we talked about the actual specs and the PCB layout here for the Trinity, let's go ahead and talk about component weights next. Now, just to preface this section, as I talked about my full review, PWNAGE is advertising that the Trinity as a whole is going to weigh in somewhere between 37 to 39 grams, and that weight spec applies to both the cut and the solid-sided version, but my Trinity was well outside this advertised weight spec, weighing in at 41.3 grams, so if you do get the Trinity, expect a little bit of a heavier mouse than PWNAGE is advertising. Starting off, we have the top shell here, which weighs a collective 9.4 grams. The base shell with the 300 mAh battery still installed weighs a collective 11.9 grams. Now keep in mind this battery is probably accounting for 4 to 5 grams of this weight here, so if you mod the battery out for a smaller capacity, lighter battery, it will cut a significant amount of weight off the Trinity. The main clicks weigh in around 3.9 grams, the side buttons weigh 0.7 grams, the scroll wheel weighs 0.9 grams, the side button PCB with the ribbon cable still attached weighs 0.9 grams, the sensor PCB weighs 2.5 grams, and the main board with the ribbon cable still attached weighs 9.4 grams, and all the screws inside the Trinity weigh up for a collective 0.7 grams. Alright, well now that we've talked about component specs and weights, let's go ahead and start our reassembly process, and we're going to start off with the base shell here. Now, because of the thinness and extreme flexibility of the Trinity's base, we're actually not going to use the cloth for this part. We're going to make sure this is on a flat surface, because if you over tension the screws on the base here for either the sensor PCB or the motherboard itself, there's a potential you could actually warp the base, so we do need to be rather careful when reassembling this mouse, so make sure you reassemble the Trinity on a very flat surface. Now, first off, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and re-anchor the sensor PCB, which is very easy to do as there are two little holes on the sides of the PCB, which correspond to two little standoffs here on the main board. Another way of thinking about this is that you can just orient it where this ribbon connector is just facing the rear of the mouse, but you can just go ahead and drop that into place. And once it's dropped into place, just put a little pressure on the top and make sure the plastic is sitting roughly even with the surface of the PCB, just like that. And once you've verified it's sitting flat, you can go ahead and re-anchor these screws here. Just again, be careful not to over tension these, only screw these in until you feel a little bit of resistance from the screw. Alright, and then once that's done, just verify that your base is sitting completely flat, and if it is, you can go on to the next step, which will be reinstalling the main board. But before we do that, we have to re-anchor the scroll wheel, which is pretty easy to do. Now, to do this, all you have to do is just take the scroll wheel and look for the thinner end, as you can see here, there it is, and you want to take this thin end and put it into this little hole in the encoder. So line this up with the hole in the encoder and then just press it in. Now, because there are standoffs on the base here for the scroll wheel, don't press it in all the way like this. You want to have it sitting out kind of like that, because a piece of plastic has to go in between the wheel itself and the actual encoder. So make sure you leave a little bit of a gap there. But once that's done, you can go ahead and reinstall the main PCB to the base, which is very easily done, as all you have to do is just line up the scroll wheel with the little standoffs here and just drop it into place just like that. Now, if it doesn't sit flat, pull the scroll wheel out a little more just to give it a little more leeway. And then once it's roughly in place, you can just press down gently to press the PCB into place. And again, just like we did with the central PCB here, just make sure that the plastic is sitting roughly flush with the actual board itself. So it looks like we're good there. And then we can go ahead and reinstall the anchoring screws that go here, 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 and here. Also, quick side note, before you screw everything down, just make sure you pull this battery cable out of the way to make sure it's not stuck under the PCB. And once it's clear of any interference, go ahead and anchor all these screws down. But again, just like we did for the screws here, make sure you gently screw these in until you feel a little bit of resistance. Don't over tension them. And then once that's done, again, make sure that your base is sitting completely flat. It shouldn't have any warping to it, so it looks like we're good here. And then once you've verified the base is flat, go ahead and take a look at your scroll wheel and just gently push it over a little bit. Most likely you pulled it a little too far out when you went to install the board, so you can just nestle it into its proper position by just gently pressing it into place and make sure it's still functioning. And then next we can go ahead and reinstall this ribbon cable for the adjustable sensor. And we can do this by pulling up on the side of the connector to open it, and then feed this into the opening in the top, kind of like that. And then make sure that it's sitting flat in the shell. You can see a little bit of a blue there. You just want to make sure it's sitting flat and even with the PCB itself. So it should be sitting roughly like this, and then just clip it into place just like that. And then lastly, we can reconnect our battery by just gently seating this into this JST connector, taking your fingernail and just gently pressing on both sides to re-anchor it into place. Now before we move on, what I recommend doing is flipping your Trinity over and verifying that everything here on the main board still functions. So check your sensor, check your scroll wheel click, check the main clicks, check to make sure everything is working before you move forward. If the unit isn't turning on, it's most likely because this JST connector isn't seated properly, and if the sensor isn't working, it's probably because this cable wasn't anchored properly, so just re-anchor it. But once you've verified everything is functional here, we can go ahead and turn this off. We'll put that off to the side, and now we can go ahead and reassemble the top shell. Alright, and in terms of the top shell here, the first thing we're going to do is re-anchor the main clicks. Now this process is kind of similar to what we did to remove them, but basically you need to put them into the shell from the bottom and then level them out, and what you need to do is you need to bend this piece back so it goes over the stabilizers while also pushing the front click stabilizers over their actual anchoring points, which are here and here. So it's a little hard to visualize, but just put the clicks in from the bottom of the shell like this and basically line up the stabilizers at the front of the shell like this, and you see how you can't push it anymore because it makes contact with the stabilizers. Then you need to pull this up and push it in and over like that, and then once it's sitting on top you can press these down and that will anchor them into place. Again, a very different method of anchoring the main clicks considered what we normally see on most mice, but it is still functional and still serviceable, which is great to see. Once that's done, we can go ahead and re-anchor the main clicks here, but as I mentioned earlier, and as I say when I do all these teardowns when it comes to main clicks, be very careful anchoring these down. Only screw them in until you feel a little bit of feedback from the screw. Do not over tension the screws, as you will break your main clicks if you do so. Alright, and then once those are done, just verify your clicks have a little bit of a buoyancy to them, as they should. And then next up, we can go ahead and re-anchor our side buttons, which is very easy to do. All we do is kind of rest them into the side shell, roughly like that. And what you want to do is you want to push down on these two sides here, push them into place, and then just make sure the clicks are actually standing out of the side shell like this, and make sure they still have some buoyancy to them. And once that is done, that is how you install your side buttons. And then lastly, we can go ahead and re-anchor the side button PCB. All you have to do is slide the PCB into its little holder, just like that. And then again, because the PCB can shift so much, you're going to have to hold this in place like this while you anchor the screw. So I'd recommend putting the screw on the end of your screwdriver just to make this easy. And then go back to the shell, push this all the way in to make sure that it's actually sitting in place, and then screw this in. But you have to screw this in to a point where it's not pushing the PCB so far, but also not too loose where it's allowing it to shift. So it's kind of a sweet spot, as I mentioned earlier. An easy way to tell if it's over tightened is you can see how the PCB will shift like that. That means you've over tightened it, and if it's under tightened, obviously the board will shift around a little bit. So again, just kind of find that sweet spot that I mentioned earlier, which for me is right about there. And then once you've checked that, just make sure the PCB doesn't actually move. If it shifts a little bit, that's okay. There's not really a lot you can do that, but you just want to make sure it's anchored in place, and then just make sure that your side buttons are still actuatable. But with that, that is everything for reassembling the top shell here for the Trinity, and next we can go ahead and put the unit back together. Alright, now to reconnect the top and the base shell, the first thing we have to do is we have to re-anchor the side button PCB, which can be kind of finicky because this cable is very short and very difficult to work with, and the connector is very small. Now to do this, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go ahead to this little connector here and put this into the open position, just like we did for the ribbon cable here. And then while taking the shells and kind of anchoring them together roughly like this, you want to gently put this cable into its connector, kind of like that. Now the connector should sit roughly even, and again, make sure this blue piece is even with the PCB, or as even as you can get it, and then just with your finger just press down, and that should anchor the side buttons into place. Now before you actually connect the top and the bottom shells, flick your unit on and verify that your side buttons are still functional. If they don't work, reseat this cable because it probably isn't seated properly, but if you did this correctly, it should sit flat and you should be good to go. And then to re-anchor the top shells, as I mentioned earlier, there are these clips at the top here that correspond to these little standoffs up at the front here, and you have to kind of put them into these holes, which is difficult because you have to clip the shells down to secure them while also pushing them forward, which is a very awkward experience. The easiest way I found to do this was to push the shells together at the front of the mouse, and this does take a lot of pressure, so don't worry about that. And see, this is what happens a lot of the time, one side won't properly anchor. So you kind of have to play around with this a little bit. Again, it is really difficult to do this, but if you do it correctly, you should be able to clip it in like that, make sure all the sides are even, and then you can press along the sides of the shell to re-anchor the whole thing. And then once that's done, you can go re-anchor the two base screws. Alright, and then with the two base screws re-anchored, you can go ahead and put back on your stock skates, and that is how you disassemble and fully reassemble the PWNAGE Trinity while also fixing the main clicks and the side buttons. Alright, and with that, that is everything for today's episode of Teardown. Overall, the Trinity is a serviceable unit on the surface, as it's still easy to take apart to just do minor service things like cleaning the unit or swapping the battery or fixing the main clicks or the side buttons, but just like all the other PWNAGE mice, the deeper you go into the unit, the more complex it gets and the less serviceable it gets. Still serviceable by users by all means, but again, the carbon fiber material is a lot trickier to work with compared to the Stormbreaker, so there is some pretty significant differences into how you actually have to service this unit compared to their previous mice, but nonetheless, as we've seen with all PWNAGE mice, the Trinity is still fairly serviceable, just a little quirky in some aspects. But that's going to be everything for me. Thank you very much for watching. Big thank you to all of our channel members who help make what I do here on the channel possible. If you didn't know, channel members not only directly support my efforts with the Teardown project and of course the in-depth reviews, they also get exclusive early access to all upcoming videos here on the channel. So if you want to see episodes of Teardown or the Melon review before anyone else, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month. Alternatively, if you'd like to support my efforts here, you can also use code MELON with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, and Metkeys to of course save yourself a little bit of money off your orders and help support the channel. But that's everything for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of Teardown. Peace.